Hello, where we are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
All right, dear. What will you have to drink?
Honestly, we finally have somebody coming on this podcast who can make a decent cocktail. I'd like Tyler to make me a cocktail if possible. All the way from Toronto.
I'm not offended. He makes a great cocktail as long as he's making me one too. This is Where is the Love? I'm Michael Ware.
I'm also Ware.
And, dear, it's been a crazy week. A crazy week, and I'm so glad to be to the weekend with you.
Yes.
Because we have been like ships in the night.
Yes.
It is just been a lot of work this week. Good work. Work that we offer up to the Lord, but we're also glad the Lord offers us Sabbath because, Lord, are we grateful for it? We had a lot of work just for the consulting practice.
Yeah.
Our two babies are insane. And
yes.
That always, that's a factor, to say the least. And then I decided to take a writing assignment that I probably shouldn't have because of the schedule, but I was excited about the pitch and what the editor pitched me on, and so excited to share that with you all. But I wrote it over the course of just 5-6 days, and if I say anything about the topic, it'll give it away. And frankly, they haven't accepted it yet, so I don't want egg on my face if they look at the draft and say, "Oh, we don't want you in this issue. This isn't great." So I won't give you the topic at this point, but hopefully you'll see it published in a print magazine in the coming months. But yeah, it was just crazy. I got little sleep. You rarely get the sleep that you deserve and need, and so
right.
But yeah, glad to be here on the weekend with you. We have a date night tomorrow. We're going to see Batman. I'm very excited about it. We saw West Side Story last night. I thought it was a masterpiece. You just don't like West Side Story. But
I just don't like West Side Story people. Although Steven Spielberg loves that musical because you could tell how much he loved it with how he shot that movie. I mean, unbelievable.
Yeah. No, it was really good. I think the other thing that made the week... we did a ton of work on the Substack. So thank you to those who participated in the thread, those of you who didn't, who weren't talking on the thread, but told me, "Oh, this is so helpful to have this as I'm watching through the State of the Union," or you read through it after the State of the Union. But we did a live thread as we usually try to do for sort of big speeches, debates. That's something we offer to subscribers for the Reclaiming Hope newsletter. And we hadn't had an opportunity to do one in a while, so we decided to do it for the State of the Union and really enjoyed the conversation there. Really enjoyed the thoughts so many of you shared. Really got both affirming and approving of President Biden. Also some really good comments from those who aren't Biden supporters sometimes about what they appreciated from a president that they didn't vote for, and then other times really insightful critiques of what the president did or did not say. It really it helped me as I was processing the State of the Union, and so want to thank folks for that. As always, we did the political brief, the faith brief, and so it was just a busy week, but glad to be here and glad to be on this episode where we're 11 episodes in, Melissa, and for the first time we have a guest.
That's right.
And it's, this is a marital podcast. These are sort of our conversations, and we're offering them for those who want to kind of listen in. But if there's been a conversation partner in our marriage, it's been Tyler.
No, for real.
Tyler is just one of our dearest friends, and he also happens to be he's a pastor. He's a longtime activist. He was founder of the Two Futures Project, which we talk about this a little bit in the podcast. Tyler's a very humble guy. He also, I think, has a healthy understanding of how much you could take credit for in politics, which for folks who have heard me talk about this, I think it's very important, especially when it's you. However, as Tyler's friend, I will give him a significant amount of credit for helping get the New START treaty done in 2010. As I mentioned on the podcast, President Obama's national security advisor would also have similar comments to make about Tyler. But nonetheless, the Reverend Dr. Tyler Wigg-Stevenson is currently associate priest at St. Paul's Bloor Street with oversight of formation and evangelism ministries. Tyler is originally from San Diego and has lived in Toronto since 2011. Prior to entering Anglican ministry, Tyler was an ordained Baptist and worked in the faith-based charity sector, most notably as the founder of the Two Futures Project for the abolition of nuclear weapons. He is also the author of several books, including Brand Jesus, and one of my all-time favorite books, I believe it was a CT Book of the Year.
Yep.
The World is Not Ours to Save. I'll just say it, there have been some books that have come out since that seem to have been greatly inspired by Tyler's book.
True.
Which is good. I mean, in a sense, that's why you write a book. You want the ideas to spread. I will say Tyler's book is fantastic, so I hope you'll pick it up. Tyler holds degrees from Swarthmore College, where he got a bachelor's of high honors, a Yale Div School, MDiv, summa cum laude, and the University of St. Michael's College, where he just received his PhD in theology, and we're so proud of him. And Tyler and his wife, Natalie, who's amazing.
We love Natalie.
We love Natalie. She's a theologian, and gosh, we should probably have Natalie on at some point.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
I love that conversation.
And they have 3 young daughters who we love and who we hold a very fond place in our hearts for. And they live in Toronto's East End. Melissa, before we jump to the conversation with Tyler, which we just recorded it.
Yes.
And it was as powerful and as helpful as I think we anticipated going in. Probably somehow Tyler always finds a way to exceed those expectations. But why don't you share just a little bit about why we wanted to have Tyler as our first guest on the podcast and why we thought now was an appropriate time?
I think that there's some things going on right now since Russia began invading Ukraine, a week and a half ago, where nukes are back on the table. And this is at a time where millennials, Gen Z, most millennials were born after the Cold War ended, and some were, very young, probably too young to remember much of anything. And so we're a generation who is not used to having nuclear weapons or nuclear annihilation on the table. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, other wars that the United States has been involved in, this hasn't been a conversation. And so I think it's very easy, unless you literally are sitting in a Russian history class or a history class in the USSR, if you're not sitting in classes like that, we don't talk about nuclear weapons enough, even though they exist. The United States and Russia each have thousands of them. And because we don't talk about them, we don't think about them. But now that they're back and this idea of nuclear annihilation is back on the table, it's, I think, very scary for people. I think everybody's asking a lot of questions about, will this happen? Would Russia use nuclear weapons either in Ukraine or in Europe, or, against the US or elsewhere? What would happen if they use them? How would the United States respond? Why do we have nuclear weapons? Have we ever done anything to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons we have? These are all valid questions, and questions that we thought were extremely worthy of asking, not just as people who care about the world and care about what happens in our politics, but as Christians. Michael and I think there's a moral imperative to be asking these questions as Christians. And we thought that Tyler would be the best person to talk about that sort of intersection of issues at hand here, and talk about it in a way that's just deeply informed as a pastor, but also as someone who's been an activist and someone who's been in the policy making rooms on these issues. We just think the world of him, and we're really excited that he was willing to be a guest, even though, like you said, Michael, that our podcast really isn't guest space. We just knew that he was the perfect person to be talking about these issues.
Yeah, look, this is a new podcast. We're so grateful for the listeners we have, but our audience is growing. It's not, we don't think that this podcast is necessarily single-handedly sort of going to change the conversation. But look, I want to play my part, and I know you want to play your part in. Look, you see it. You see how the appetite of people is feeding into the machine, and the way the machine is feeding the appetite for these stories that glorify and glamorize war. But I think what we're trying to say with the last episode, with this episode, what's one of the serious messages of this podcast, and really, if I could just speak of my work, is we need to pay very close attention to what politics is doing to our souls. I've said before, you may not be interested in acting in politics, but politics is always interested in acting on you. And I don't mean that just by policy, though that's true, but also by the culture of our politics. And we're in a very critical season now where the affections and the appetites of the public is actually going to play a role in how policymakers move forward with this. There's been a lot of conversation about and again, this is just an opinion, but part of the conversation has been, President Biden has been, responsible. He's not been ratcheting up the, well, that happens within, yes, you could be a statesman of conviction, and that could just be your approach. But let me tell you, even statesmen of conviction have to respond to the political environment around them. And we have seen in the past statesmen who have been war weary feel pushed into conduct that had the environment been different, their judgment about the wisdom of those actions might have been different as well. The sort of the playing field, sort of the set of circumstances they're operating in. What the people are asking for is a part of that. So look, we're going to get to the interview, get to Tyler, but I just hope this is helpful to you in the audience. I hope that you feel like this podcast is a place where you can come to learn about and participate in a conversation about the very serious events that are unfolding in Ukraine and really around the world right now, in a way that isn't naive or Pollyanna-ish or sort of avoiding the very serious decisions that have to be made, but also isn't treating this like a game. Also isn't treating this Here's the last thing I'll say, which is there is people want you to believe that morality ends where war begins. Mm-hmm. And the bigger game that's being played is people want you to believe that morality ends when things get tough. Mm-hmm. And for Christians, we need to be able to say, no, it's actually in the very thick of things, when the pressure is on, that the way of Jesus holds up. And so we're going to talk about that with Tyler. Hope you enjoy the interview. Tyler, it's so good to have you with us on Where's the Love. Thanks so much for joining.
Oh man, it's really fun to see you guys. It's been way too long.
Seriously.
Yeah, no, it really has been. But when after Melissa and I recorded last week's episode, we stopped recording, and we've never had a guest on this podcast before. But we were like,
oh my gosh.
We need to have Tyler.
You're the first.
You're the first guest.
Oh. You're the first guest. Yeah, 11 episodes in, and you're our first guest. We just
knew hashtag honored/humbled. You know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's I think one of the reasons is we just love talking with you about anything. But B, no one's been I think more impactful in my life in I think having a sober approach to conflict, the cost of war, and Melissa and I talked on last week's episode about some of the flippancy that we've been seeing, and then of course, probably early this week. Although I guess Putin had made some comments, but really this week we saw the nuclear conversation really sort of percolate and become a real sort of topic of concern and discourse. And so, wanted to have you on to talk us through. And I guess where I'd like to start, Tyler, is obviously this is an impossible sort of question to answer in a full way, but would love for you to just orient our listeners to, the role that nuclear weapons play in global affairs. What function do they serve, and what kind of damage could they inflict? It's been such a long time. Obviously, North Korea, the conversation about nuclear weapons sort of comes up with Iran, I guess, but right. It's so different for this generation, I think. Where sort of the likelihood, the sort of the immediacy of the nuclear threat, it has really not been. There are a lot of threats that face millennials and Gen Z, but nuclear weapons really hasn't been at the top of folks' mind until I think this week in some critical ways. Yes. So orient us to just sort of the role of nuclear weapons in global affairs.
Well, that you're right. That is a huge question, but I'll do my best. So, I mean, I think the best way to kind of break it down is historically, so that after World War II, with the advent of nuclear weapons in armed conflict, when the United States dropped the only 2 nuclear weapons ever used in war on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you start to see a buildup of nuclear weapons. And the expansion of nuclear powers. So it goes from the United States to the USSR, and then gradually the United Kingdom, France, and China joined the nuclear club, followed thereafter by India and Pakistan. Israel's in the mix there. South Africa has a covert nuclear arsenal. All of this leading up to all of these are nuclear states by the end of the Cold War. But overwhelmingly, the stockpiles, which in the height, I think the height of the global nuclear arsenal would have been in 1986, if my memory serves right, when you're talking about something on the order of 70 to 80,000 nuclear weapons worldwide. the vast majority of which are possessed by the United States and the Soviet Union as the leading powers in the Cold War.
Yeah.
And that's those levels of arsenals, and the disproportionate possession by the U.S. and Russia, and then or Soviet Union, and then that arsenal gets passed to Russia, and that's complicated and also related to what we're seeing today,
Yeah.
because some of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons were in Ukraine, but then were transferred to Russia, when Ukraine became its own country, um, in the breakup of the Soviet Union. Um, what we're seeing in terms of the sort of current state of nuclear weapons worldwide, where the U.S. and Russia have roughly equivalent strategic nuclear weapons in the order of 2,500 to 3,000 a piece that are ready to go, basically, and not all of those are deployed. That's an inheritance of the Cold War, with the U.S. and Russia having the bulk of the armaments. Then you've got everybody else as an order of magnitude smaller than that in terms of the numbers that they've got. So you've got they're different, but China, UK, France, these are kind of roughly parallel. Pakistan and India roughly parallel. Israel just a little bit below those, and then North Korea at the bottom of the list with about 20 nuclear weapons. And all these are guesstimates, because nobody really knows. Nobody gives, these countries don't give this data. And I think historically, what's important for people to understand is there's these different phases. Like, nuclear weapons aren't a magic spell that you cast it and it does this thing. They're a device that plays out differently in different historical contexts. So it's one thing when you've got the mutual assured destruction of the armament levels of the Cold War. Cold War ends, and these countries do not give up their nuclear weapons, although there was a hot moment where we hoped that might be possible. And then their usage starts to change. So with Russia degrading into sort of a petro state run by oligarchs, it's basically their claim at being great power status. There's not much else that would put them in that club. With others, it's sort of the post-war powers, the people who won World War II. It's kind of their claim at there's no coincidence that for a long time the 5 nuclear weapon states are also the permanent members of the UN Security Council, right? So they serve this kind of totemic function of status, because they represent a country's capacity to wreak unimaginable damage upon an adversary. With the U.S. and Russia, probably world-ending damage. With the lower nuclear powers, I mean, certainly civilization-ending damage, but maybe not necessarily like kill everybody on the planet. But there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. So to get to where we are now, I think what's a fair way of characterizing, say, the last decade, and I'm playing a little bit fast and loose here, but roughly the second decade of the 2000s, is you've got this kind of battle of non-proliferation. So you've got the U.S. and Russia scaling back their arsenals because, frankly, the levels that they were at were so bloated that they're just even if you think nuclear weapons are a good thing, they had way too many. Why spend that many? Why spend that much? You don't need it. You've got other countries sort of stabilizing their arsenals, maybe building up a little bit. You've got the modernization comes into the question of, are we keeping these up to date? A lot of metaphors of, like, tuning up the old Corvette in the garage. And then you've got the breakout nuclear powers, and Korea and North Korea and Iran would be, not that Iran has any nuclear weapons, but that's the fear, right? So
Right.
You've got, is the nuclear club going to expand? And so that's kind of the state of play. As to what role they play in geopolitics and global affairs, I think that depends on who you ask. I mean, I think, and this is where I think things get really dangerous things are dangerous enough with Ukraine, but once once whatever is happening now at least resolves to whatever uncomfortable reality follows this, the awfulness that's unfolding right now, and we start asking, what's this mean, right? There are going to be some voices that say, well, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, they wouldn't have gotten invaded. And I think that's certainly North Korea's understanding. In terms of looking at Iraq and seeing the U.S. war that played out, the American war that played out there, and saying like, well, that's the lesson that they learned from that. That the way to sort of assure sovereignty is the capacity to have this nuclear capacity. And so that's certainly one narrative. Another narrative would be on the U.S. and Russian side. That right, this is. Well, those are actually different. From the Russian side, it's that assurance of great power status, the level of nuclear weapons that they have. France and Britain, I think it's about sort of maintaining a kind of military relevance to go along with economic power. Israel's its own unique case. India and Pakistan, you're talking about nuclear weapons in a highly regional conflict setting. So anyway, I could go on ad nauseum about that. But so what role they play? Yeah, it depends on who you ask, because they're a tool. And one time here in the freezing, what's a hammer for, right? Well, it's for banging in nails into a wall. But I'll tell you, one time we were here in freezing winter in Toronto, and the drain froze over in the parking lot of our condo complex, and Natalie was out there with a hammer wailing away at the ice pack on it. So like, what's a hammer for? Depends on who you ask, depends on where you're asking, right? Same goes for nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's right. So the last few weeks have reminded Europe of the potential for war on the continent. And it's also reminded Europe of the specter of these nuclear weapons and the destruction and the tool and the sort of abilities that it gives a country. So as an activist, as someone who knows government officials, you're familiar with diplomats and military officials, and as a pastor, talk to us about what that means to have that as a possibility, what it means to have nuclear weapons and the ability for nuclear war.
Yeah, I mean, again, lots of different ways to answer that too. As you say, it kind of depends on where you're sitting. I mean, I haven't been in the activist sphere as my kind of primary vocation for 10 years now, which is kind of shocking to realize. And since then, I mean, my world is kind of my parish. So that's my level of focus, and I'm seeing people being really scared. There's some poll that went by that said, a majority of Canadians think this is going to turn into World War III. I think nobody has any concept of what that would mean. I mean, what it means is that you can imagine a chain of events transpiring where this turns into a full-fledged nuclear conflict between the United States and Russia, and it's not science fiction. It's a lot of worst case scenarios playing out. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. Right. You could see how it goes wrong. You could write that story without difficulty. And right now, I'm really grateful for what I think has been the measured response of the West, especially. I think I have no love for any of the nuclear weapons establishment, but I appreciate the way that the American response has been to Putin sort of doing this largely, I think, performative escalation of readiness to say like, well, okay, nothing's really changed. We are where we are. We're not going to push back. We don't have to do a tit for tat here. Right. From my armchair perspective, I'm just applauding that. But I think what it does is it brings for people, and it's existentially disconcerting to realize that you are watching a story that could play out with the death of the majority of human beings on the planet. Yeah. And absolutely the end of the world as we know it, beyond any question. And I think that's unnerving for people because we like to imagine that sort of the game of life has a field that it's played on, and things can go badly for you or well, but you kind of know what could go wrong. I think the pandemic has kind of shaken us all in that respect. Like none of us has ever lived through a reality like this, and then to have this unfolding, I think people are sort of like, wondering like, well, I've seen the world go wrong in ways I couldn't have imagined, and now this is happening. Could this happen too? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Again, you know, there wouldn't be any bookies left to pay me out. So I've not put, if I were putting money on the situation, I would say no. I don't think that it's going to spiral into a nuclear war. But you could certainly see you could certainly see a way that nuclear weapons are used. And then I think most people don't distinguish between nuclear weapons and power.
Yeah.
But certainly nuclear power that's been one of the headlines every couple of days with this conflict with Putin's war. So the conflict around Chernobyl and the Russian seizure of Chernobyl, and then the most recent firefight at this Ukrainian nuclear power plant. A friend of mine texted me to say, what do I make of this? And I was like, well, it's not going to be a nuclear detonation. That can't happen at a nuclear power plant. But what it could cause is a release of nuclear materials, and then it's really bad if you're in the immediate vicinity or downwind from that. That's potentially affecting all of Europe.
Yeah. Tyler, your efforts and through Two Futures Project, your partners, you were doing that effort like NAE, like USCCB. I know so many others were so critical to getting New START done. Would you tell our listeners what New START was, and have you been reflecting at all on that work and what it took to get there over the course of the last couple of months?
Yeah, so New START was the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. New START would have been the new one, so to follow on the old ones that had been put in place by previous American and Russian administrations. And these are the treaties that were responsible for bringing our nuclear weapons down from those ridiculous Cold War levels to the less ridiculous, but still ridiculous levels that they are today. So New START, when is New START? 2010?
Yeah.
Am I getting my dates right? And turning into an old man. I mean, you're very kind to say that my work was important to that. I'm not quite sure I'd agree with your sense of causality there, but we did what little part we could.
Take it up with the president's national security advisor,
Yeah,
Tyler.
I will. It up with next time we get a drink, I'll do that. Anyway, but so New START, basically, without getting into the weeds, it brought the nuclear weapons down a little bit more and established a transparency between the two nations so that each could be assured that the other was doing what they were saying they were doing. That's the nuts and bolts of New START. I have New START. I always felt the way it got enacted was quite a compromise, because what had to be agreed on the American side was the quote unquote modernization of the American nuclear arsenal, and that committed billions and billions and billions of dollars for upgrades to nuclear weapons, which upgrades to American nuclear weapons, which kind of guarantees the functioning of the nuclear weapons complex for decades to come.
No,
was it worth it? I don't know. The thing that I've been reflecting on as I've watched this unfold is I'm committed to the abolition of nuclear weapons on a moral basis and on a theological basis. But that kind of work, a commitment to abolition is, I compare it to, it's like water, and it runs through whatever the creek bed of current events looks like.
Right.
And right now, the U.S. and Russia aren't going to sit down and negotiate further reductions to their arsenals. If anything, the cries are going to be pushing in the alternate direction, even though it's stupid.
Right.
But I think what it points out is kind of, I think there's a limit to to the usefulness or the utility of these kind of Cold War processes in terms of getting us where we need to go over the long haul. They're always going to be subject to the vagaries of current events, and which is why I've grown quite supportive of the nuclear ban treaty, the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which has gone into effect in the United Nations. So nuclear weapons are technically illegal, and the, now, of course, countries then do what they want. So, but it changes the norm. It
Yeah.
changes the norm, and it gives you something to point to. So, yeah, I mean, I think New Start was worth the fight. There's not going to be a newer start.
Yeah.
I don't think, at least not for a long time.
Right.
I have no idea what the future holds in terms of all of this. In my darker moments, I think that the only thing that a fundamental conviction I have as an activist, and I would still call myself that, even though it's not how I make my bread and butter anymore, such as it is. I've become a priest, right? But as an activist, I'm convinced that people don't change unless they're experiencing discomfort in some way. It can be emotional, it can be economic. No one changes unless they don't like where they are, and I'm not sure anything will be able to motivate change short of something like a nuclear disaster. And the only question would be whether or not we survive it.
Right.
And then that it motivates a certain kind of behavior, because it could obviously spiral in the other direction. It could, you just don't know once you let that out of the bag. Nobody is a fortune teller. Nobody can predict that. So I don't know. I don't know what's coming. I think anybody who says they know where we're headed is a liar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or deluded.
Yeah. I think just the last question, Tyler, is just, as Christians, what do we have to bring to bear? What is the best lens through which we should see nuclear weapons, nuclear warfare, even just more broadly, sort of the war. What do we have to bring to bear to these conversations, and how would you urge folks to be thinking about and praying about what we're seeing unfold in the Ukraine and on the broader global scene?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, I don't have anything like an authoritative answer, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. I mean, I think on the one hand, I think, there's certainly, and I say this with some caveats, because I think people are kind of experiencing the horror of war for the first time, which is really ironic, given that we've been in wars for 2 decades, and yet this is the first time that for a lot of people it's like coming home. So that's a whole other kettle of fish, and it involves race and imperialism and all sorts of things. So, leaving that aside, I think that this is bringing home for people the horror of war. I don't. There was a picture I saw of a Ukrainian teacher who'd volunteered to go fight, and here's this woman who looks like a kindergarten teacher, like she could be in a movie as a kindergarten teacher, with a rifle between her knees, just sort of weeping as she's going off. And I thought, how afraid she must be, because that's not what her life was a couple days beforehand, and how not only that she was going to be asked to risk her life, but she was going to be asked to kill. That this is turning people into killers. That's something we should view with abhorrence. The moral infliction of turning people into killers. And I think it shows us how lightly we hold killing.
Yes.
In contrast to what I think is a biblically informed ethic. So there's that. I mean, I think it brings home the horror of war and the way in which it, all these kind of, in the Psalms, you constantly read about kind of deliverance from fear of your enemies. And I think for most of us in our modern context, kind of, it takes some interpretation to kind of read that. And then you're like, oh no, this is what it looks like to be afraid that you're going to be killed. And so I think it highlights the importance of praying for peace, and the value of peace that most of us just kind of take for granted. Um, it's the in in Paul's letters, the rationale for praying for government is that we can live quiet lives. Like, you want the government to do its job so that you can get about the business of being alive, which is to live a life righteous before God and sort of quietness and holiness. And war takes that away. It's
Yes.
So there's that.
Mm.
In terms of nuclear weapons, like I said, I mean, I think, there's right now, you got all the pundits sort of jockeying for space at the starting line to be able to define what this means for nuclear weapons once things resolve enough. I don't even want to say calm down, resolve enough, hopefully not more catastrophically than they are right now, to be able to start saying, what does this mean? And I think what I would want people to take away from this is kind of, as war is to normal life, nuclear weapons are to war. That people are going to have conflicts. I mean, who does not have conflicts in their families and their relationships? Walking down the street. But these conflicts don't carry existential weight, and they don't threaten to turn into the end of everything. Mostly, you hope they don't. There are guardrails, and nuclear weapons represent the capacity for whatever your beef is in any given moment. And I don't mean to, treat what's happening, the conflict lightly, but whatever the conflict is in any given moment, to be the end of everything for everyone.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which on like a level that my 5-year-old could understand just isn't fair. Moreover, I think, you asked how we approach this as Christians, and I think I did some reflecting on towards a biblical theology, or like what's the Bible say about nuclear weapons? And I mean, on the surface, obviously the answer is not much. Nuclear weapons aren't in the Bible, but the Bible's full of questions of what do we trust? What do you put your trust in? And I think we have to look quite seriously at the fact that by tolerating nuclear weapons as the sort of ultimate guardrail for our security,
absolutely,
I think there's a fundamental idolatry there, because nuclear weapons can't be used justly.
Right.
I'm not a pacifist. I think there could be a just use for a rifle. Maybe there's a just use for a tank. I don't know. I wouldn't want to commit myself too much here. There's not a just use for napalm. There's not a just use for nuclear weapons. And so what that means is that you sort of tolerate this wicked edge. It's like, and it's the ethical dilemma posed at the end of A Few Good Men, where the Jack Nicholson character says, you all depend on this amoral or immoral periphery to have your quaint little moral lives. It's got a certain rhetorical appeal, but it's fundamentally unbiblical. Yes. Because the king is not saved by the size of his army or the might of his arm, or you're not saved by a war horse or the number of chariots you have. You're saved by the Lord God. And so I think there's the question of what are you really trusting in? That is what we have to wrestle with, and then pray accordingly, and then settle in for the long haul. Because, like I said, the work can be morally informed, and yet what is politics is the art of the possible, right? So it's going to depend quite a bit on what current events allow. But you keep moving. You hold on to what you believe, regardless of how plausible it might seem in the given moment.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tyler, for that incredible conversation. So glad to have you on. Melissa, first of all, just love Tyler and the spirit he brings and the ministry that he has. Very important. Tyler was just very careful. He was representing himself, not the views of the church denomination. Tyler was on the podcast sort of representing his own point of views, and so just wanted to make that disclaimer. But Melissa, we always learn so much from Tyler when we talk to him. and so glad to be able to share them with all of you. Would urge you to pick up his books, especially "The World Is Not Ours to Save" is, I think, a really meaningful book right now. Melissa, any final thoughts before we land the plane?
No, I think that was a wonderful conversation, and I'm really hopeful that it will help you all as you're thinking about this current conflict.
Yeah. All right, folks. Well, it's always wonderful to be with you again. Would encourage you to leave a review on iTunes. It will help us get the word out about this podcast. Share it with your friends. Subscribe at reclaiminghope.substack.com, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.
You told me